This is episode 73 of That Shakespeare Life. This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm Paul Menzer, professor of Shakespeare performance at Mary Bowen University and author of Anecdotal Shakespeare, A New Performance History. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
The popular response it was commented on at the time and sort of Grummet suggests was maybe closer to sort of apathy and resignation. So by the time Shakespeare is writing, I think English ownership of Calais is something to look back on with pride. The loss of Calais is still a cause of regret. But I think it's very much something sort of consigned to the past rather than a source of continuing sort of present concern.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, she inherited a tense political and religious tension that bordered dangerously close to civil war throughout her reign. There was a tension between Protestantism and Catholicism in England, and historical basis for the wars with France, the reputation of the Huguenots, and the painful English loss of Calais after ruling it for 150 years all played a role in the reception of small details, including the representation of France beside England in plays like William Shakespeare's Henry V for the audiences sitting in the playhouses. France, religion were tumultuous topics, with many people, now Protestant by government decree, had parents, even Shakespeare's own father, who had potentially closeted Catholic sentiments. As with many things, the context of religion versus government, or something even more casual, was a giant ball of complicated emotions that caused playwrights like William Shakespeare to need to perform a balancing act to produce a show that would be both popular but not get him arrested in the process. Here today to help us analyze the role of religion in England, the impact of Elizabeth's religious settlement, and how the country received plays like Henry V is our guest, Dr. Jonathan Willis. Jonathan Willis is senior lecturer in early modern history at the University of Birmingham in England. His work focuses on the history of the long English Reformation and the relationship between theology and religious belief, practice, and identity. He's written books on the relationship between religious music and the English Reformation and the impact of the Reformation on the Ten Commandments or vice versa. He has also edited and co-edited collections of essays on dying, death, burial, and commemoration, on sin and salvation in Reformation England, and a guide designed to help students access and work with early modern primary sources. Hello, Jonathan. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. It's great to be here.
After Elizabeth I's father, Henry VIII, established the Church of England, it seems that the country was firmly Protestant. Why was Elizabeth's religious settlement necessary?
Okay, well, that's a really good question, and it's one that historians have kind of changed their minds on quite a lot over, say, the last sort of 50 years or so. If you ask someone this in the 60s, in the sort of mid-20th century, the sort of prevailing narrative was that, yes, the country very rapidly embraces Protestantism, the evangelical faith is very popular, the late medieval church is very unpopular, is sort of, a failing institution. And the Reformation happens very quickly. And that's what historians now refer to as the sort of traditional interpretation of the English Reformation. And it's what you get in books like A.G. Dickens's book on the English Reformation from the 60s. And then following that, sort of Reformation history went through a period of revisionism, which basically sort of rehabilitated the late medieval Catholic Church. So in the 70s and 80s and 90s, historians like Christopher Haig, Jack Scarisbrick, and most sort of notably Eamon Duffy, I guess, in his book, The Stripping of the Altars, kind of established that actually the late medieval church is very popular with most people on the eve of the Reformation, and that Protestantism, when it comes, is very kind of slow to take root, is very unpopular. Most people are very sort of hostile to the new religion. This is why we see rebellions like the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, like the Prayer Book Rebellion in 1549. So, there isn't really much of a Reformation under Henry. There's a breakaway from Rome. Henry is created supreme head of the Church of England, but not much actually happens to the country's religion. The really radical change comes during the reign of Edward VI. He's king for such a short time that the changes don't really get an opportunity to bed in. When Mary I comes on the throne, 1533 to 1558, she's quite successful and quite popular in bringing Catholicism back. So at the point that Elizabeth becomes queen in 1558, she's really faced with a situation where the majority of the country are still pretty traditional in their religious beliefs. They're still pretty Catholic, actually. And so the religious settlement is necessary to sort of create a Protestant framework, which effectively kind of brings back a kind of a late Edwardian sort of Protestant framework to replace the Catholicism that Mary has put into place, and to create a sort of create the environment for her to then go on and Protestantize the country. So Protestantism is really quite insecure, although Elizabeth, of course, is a Protestant queen, and the government, her advisors, people like William Cecil, Matthew Parker, the Archbishop of Canterbury, are all sort of committed Protestants. Actually, things still feel pretty fragile, I think, in 1558, which is why the settlement is necessary.
Now, England and France spent a lot of their collective histories at war with one another, including war against France under Henry VIII. However, by the time Elizabeth came to the throne, was England still at war with France?
England is technically sort of at war with France. I mean, you're right. Under Henry, there are sort of countless campaigns and alliances, both against France with the Empire, with the Habsburg Holy Roman Empire, also occasional alliances with France. So it's a really sort of complicated diplomatic picture. England is technically at war with France by the time Elizabeth comes to the throne. England is at war with France between about 1557 and 1559. Sort of indirectly at war with France, because this is part of a much broader conflict, the sort of Italian wars, as they're known, between the Habsburg dynasty, who are Holy Roman emperors and kings of Spain, and then the French Valois dynasty. And these wars are really sort of going on for pretty much the whole of the first half of the 16th century. So the last Italian war is sort of taking place around during the reign of Mary and at the point that Elizabeth comes to the throne. So it's during this kind of final kind of couple of years of conflict, just before Elizabeth comes to the throne, that the French successfully capture Calais, which has been England's only sort of remaining foothold on the continent for some time. The war's brought to an end by the 1559 treaty, a treaty called the Treaty of Cato Cambresis. And this brings the whole period of the Italian wars to an end. So actually, between sort of 1559 and between the early 17th century, during the 30 Years' War, when they're at odds again, England isn't actually officially at war with France for quite a long period, for pretty much all of Elizabeth's reign.
These wars with France have the reputation for having been both expensive and extremely unpopular for the people of England. Was it the wars themselves to which people objected, or were the French considered bitter enemies?
To some extent, I think it's both of those things. Wars were, and still are, extremely expensive to wage in terms of manpower, in terms of provisioning, in terms of weapons, in terms of supply chains and all these sorts of things, in terms of the ships required to transport people and all this sort of thing. So certainly during the reign of Henry VIII, people really object to the taxation required to fund them, these subsequent attempts to sort of extract more cash from the populace in order to sort of fund this conflict. So that's certainly part of it. I think there's, though, also a long history, which you sort of allude to, of anti-French sentiment in England, which is sort of fed by a long history of conflict between the two nations. For example, the 100 Years' War is perhaps the most obvious example of England trying to sort of prosecute its claims to French territory and being resisted by the French. And of course, in the 16th century, amongst their list of formal titles, the kings and queens of England still claim to be kings and queens of France as well. So yes, there's this kind of long history of war and animosity and sort of toing and froing and so forth, which I think does contribute towards a sort of a general xenophobia, actually, I think is pretty common at the time in England as in other places. I mean, I think to be foreign is something which is not generally looked upon sort of favourably by people. One of the reasons that Mary I's husband, Philip II of Spain, is so poorly received is because of his foreignness, because of his Spanishness. And I think the same sort of sentiments directed towards the French as well.
How is it with the generally negative views of the French in England that Calvinism was able to take on so strongly, since John Calvin himself was French?
I mean, the history of sort of English Protestantism begins a bit earlier than Calvin. I mean, Calvin is about, but doesn't really secure his full authority in Geneva until around sort of 1555. He arrives in Geneva earlier than that, but there's a period of sort of exile where he goes to Strasbourg and he comes back, and there's all this sort of toing and froing and hostility between him and the city council. So it's not really until sort of the middle of the reign of Mary I that Calvin becomes the kind of authoritative figure that we probably think of him as being. So the most important continental Protestant influences during the sort of formative reign of Edward VI, 1547 to 1553, are people like the Italian reformer, Peter Martyr Vermigli, who's invited over to England, the Strasbourg reformer, Martin Butzer, and also the successor of the reformer Huldrych Zwingli, Zurich, Heinrich Bullinger. And Bullinger is probably one of the sort of key figures. So by the end of the reign of Edward VI, English Protestantism has really sort of moved beyond sort of German Lutheranism and is really sort of Swiss reformed in character. Historians kind of label this branch of Protestantism capital R reformed. So it's a sort of capital R reformed, not specifically Calvinist at that point. Now, during the reign of Mary I, when a lot of English Protestants go into exile, Geneva is one of the key cities that plays hosts to English Protestant exiles. And actually, it's some of the most radical Protestant reformers, led by the Scottish reformer John Knox, who sort of head to Geneva and admire Calvin's way of sort of running things. But other cities that host reformers in this time include Frankfurt, Wesel, Emden, Strasbourg. So there's sort of a wide range of continental influences that are all kind of feeding into the English church. So Calvin does become the most influential Reformed theologian in the second half of the 16th century, but I don't really think his nationality sort of enters into it. I mean, he's a Frenchman by birth, but his model of Reformation is a Swiss, Genevan one. And so yeah, I don't really think it's sort of a massive factor in most people's perception of him. And I also think, I guess it's fair to say that the sort of Protestant elite, the kind of the reformers, the bishops, the university-trained theologians, these sorts of people, are very internationalist in outlook. So while there might be sort of a popular sort of anti-French sort of martial feeling, it's not really one that affects the kind of educated elite. They're much more sort of internationalist in their outlook, I think.
So there was a division really in class depending on which people had this overt suspicion of foreigners in general, and then people who had a more open-minded internationalist outlook. Yeah,
well, I'd be reluctant to say it's just about sort of social status and draw a kind of an absolute kind of line between sort of elite and popular.
Is it an education issue? You mentioned specifically university theologians.
It's maybe partly education, but I think it's also about context. So if you're thinking about, as we might sort of move on to think about sort of military defeats and things like that, if that's the issue, then I think, yes, there's that kind of xenophobia. If we're thinking about sort of Catholic France versus Protestant England, again, there's that kind of hostility.
Oh, I see. Okay, I understand.
If in a different context, when we're thinking about, I mean, really, I guess, sort of Protestants, and especially Reformed Protestants, see themselves as part of an international family, really, of sort of Reformed churches. So Reformed Protestants in France, in Switzerland, in England, in Eastern Europe, or in bits of, sort of Scandinavia, they sort of see themselves as co-religionists, essentially kind of united in purpose. So those kind of religious links are more important, I guess, than the specific sort of national identities that they also hold.
Now, you alluded to the anti-French strain that was in existence in England rather pervasively, albeit not apparently for religion context. But I am wondering what impact that general impression of the French would have had on the country's reception of Shakespeare's Henry V.
Well, there's an article by David Womersley on sort of anti-French, or the French and Henry V, where he suggested it's tempting to imagine that anti-French sentiment was a constant presence in early modern England. But he goes on to sort of qualify that by saying that actually that impression is illusory, and that political relations with France and also literary representations of the French sort of ebb and flow over the period. So there's not this sort of constant, unchanging kind of anti-French sentiment, but it sort of rises and falls depending on the kind of broader political context at the time. So yes, of course, thinking about Henry V, his triumph over the French at the Battle of Agincourt was one of the greatest English victories of the Hundred Years' War, probably one of the greatest sort of English military victories of all time. But the contemporary political situation in France during the reign of Elizabeth is extremely complicated, and that makes the English relationship with France complicated too. It's sort of difficult in a way to talk about France as an entity in the second half of the 16th century, because during the reign of Elizabeth I, it's sort of really complicated, but to boil it down to its essentials, during the reign of Elizabeth, France is being sort of ripped apart by 40 years or more of sort of violent sectarian civil war, known as the French Religious Wars or the French Wars of Religion. And this is a series of conflicts between French Protestants, who are known as Huguenots, a rising group of sort of radical Catholic fundamentalists, and also a group of sort of politiques or moderates, which for most of the period includes the French crown, who were trying to sort of pursue an officially sponsored policy of limited religious toleration. You have this situation where, French Protestants are seen as kind of brothers in religion, sort of fellow co-religionists, and their triumphs and their losses are celebrated and mourned in England. You also have, by the sort of late 1570s, 1580s, the formation of a radical Catholic League in France, who are pursuing a very sort of violent policy, trying to sort of destroy the Huguenot opposition. And you have an increasingly sort of desperate, weak, ineffective crown, a series of sort of minorities and regencies who are really struggling to sort of control the whole thing. So, France is a bit of a basket case for most of the reign of Elizabeth. And so the sort of English attitude to France depends on, are we talking about the crown? Are we talking about the League? Are we talking about the Huguenots? And it's quite a sort of a complicated situation overall.
So you don't think that because Henry V marries Catherine of Valois at the end of the play, that there would have been any response from the audience about seeing that on stage or having that part of their history resurrected when it was the Valois dynasty that they were fighting against some, 30 years before this was put on stage?
Oh yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I'm sure, I'm sure there would have been cheers. I'm sure it would have, stirred the spirits of the audiences. I'm sure it would have made them all feel sort of proud Englishmen, seeing the traditional enemy, defeated by one of the great sort of popular heroes of English history and culture. So absolutely, I think, that sort of historical awareness will have been there. Is one of the things that, one of the things people would have sort of read into the play. Obviously, it sort of brings to mind again, I guess, the sort of continued English claims to the French crown as well. So it's, it certainly will have had those kind of associations as well. But sort of outside the playhouse, I guess the sort of the popular and sort of establishment views of France within England at the time are sort of varied and dependent on sort of context as well.
Is there any connection between the Edict of Nantes of 1598 and Elizabeth's religious settlement?
Well, it's an interesting thing to think about. I mean, in a way, they're doing sort of very different things. So the Elizabethan settlement of 1559 is what sort of lays the foundations for the state of religion at the start of Elizabeth's reign. So it does a number of things. There's an act of supremacy, which restores Henry VIII's original supremacy of the church over the Church of England, although of course Elizabeth is not the supreme head of the church but supreme governor of the church. And that change of wording is probably in large part a concession actually to Protestants who feel that Christ should be acknowledged as head of the church, not any kind of earthly monarch. So there's this act of supremacy. There's also an act of uniformity, and this has been, since the reign of Edward VI, the name of those acts which seek to sort of establish uniformity in religious practice, uniformity of liturgy, so the sort of script which dictates the way church services are carried out. And the 1559 Act of Uniformity establishes a new 1559 Book of Common Prayer, which is to all intents and purposes very similar to the Second Edwardian Book of Common Prayer of 1552. And then the sort of third ingredient of the Elizabethan settlement is a set of injunctions or sort of instructions issued by the Crown, which go out to the parishes and sort of tell people how to practice religion at a sort of a grassroots level. So a lot of this is very kind of straightforward about, making sure you've got a communion table and a pulpit and a Bible and a set of the homilies or sort of sermons to be preached, that kind of thing. Elizabeth also puts a little bit more of a personal spin on it. So the 49th injunction, for example, talks about making sure there's provision for church music, protection of musical livings in churches, and also that the best sort of music that may be conveniently devised can be performed in church, so long as you're capable of understanding the words. So that settlement very much sort of lays the basis of the practice of religion at the start of Elizabeth's reign. And that's really what she's interested in, is conformity of religious practice. So, she's not interested necessarily in what people believe. There's the famous quote that she's not interested in making windows into men's souls. But she wants everybody to go to church every Sunday and to sit there and to listen to the sermon and to take part in the service. And the hope is, I suppose, that gradually, through that kind of exposure, her largely conservative population will become Protestantized. So the eventual goal of the Elizabethan settlement is a kind of a unified sort of Protestant church. The Edict of Nantes, which is passed in 1598 by Henry IV of France.
Yes, the correct French pronunciation there. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not going to make any claims to a French accent, but I think it's how I was taught it. The Edict of Nantes is the last of a series of edicts of pacification and toleration issued by the French crown from the sort of 1550s, 1560s onwards, from the start of the French Wars of Religion. They issue a whole series of sort of edicts to try and stop the violence, to try and stop the civil war. And these are all unsuccessful, up until the Edict of Nantes. So the Elizabethan settlement is the kind of start of her reign and the aim to produce a sort of a unified kind of religious state. What the Edict of Nantes does is actually grant substantial rights for the Huguenot minority within what is overall a Catholic French nation. So the Edict of Nantes is an exercise in limited religious toleration, in recognising that, this is a Catholic country, but we give certain legal recognition and legal rights for Protestants to sort of live and worship and hold office, within certain limits. So the vision behind Elizabeth's settlement is one of uniformity, whereas what the Edict of Nantes does is issue sort of grudging toleration in France, just to try and stop Protestants and Catholics from killing each other, which they've been doing for sort of 40 odd years.
Well, you alluded to the reputation of the Huguenots previously, and I'm wondering, I know that Shakespeare lived with the Mountjoys, who were a Huguenot family. Were the Huguenots having to leave France, and were they coming to England because of that? Is that why this family was there? And what was the reputation of a Huguenot family? Was Shakespeare staying with a reputable group, or was he doing something a little shady to be housing with foreigners?
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, the violent civil war in France sees a lot of French Huguenots emigrating, leaving France and coming to England in pursuit of religious liberty, in pursuit of I mean, at the time, England is the largest and most stable, most powerful Protestant state in Europe, really. And so it makes sense for emigrants like the Mountjoys to head to England in order to be able to practice their religion freely. So, and this has a whole series of sort of effects in England, because a lot of the people who come are skilled craftsmen. They have particular kind of expertise in fields like sort of cloth work, stuff like that. So yeah, between around sort of 1602 to 1604, Shakespeare begins renting a room in London in the house of Christopher and Marie Mountjoy. I think Christopher Mountjoy is something like a maker of ornamental headdresses for wealthy ladies. So, it's a fairly niche but fairly respectable profession that he's engaged in. And in fact, going back to the kind of reign of Edward VI, so, some sort of 50 odd years earlier than that, during the sort of archiepiscopacy of Thomas Cranmer, England establishes stranger churches in London. So stranger churches, churches for different national groups, churches for French Huguenots, churches for people from Poland, or sort of other national sort of religious groupings. All Protestant, of course, all sort of Reformed Protestant, but they're able to sort of bring their own and import their own kind of liturgies and ways of religious practice and do that sort of within Protestant London. So it's really interesting. And Shakespeare is, of course, one of the reasons we know about this is Shakespeare is engaged in legal proceedings involving the Mountjoys. But it's not really, I wouldn't say shady. It's a fairly respectable thing for him to do at the time.
Since the English ruled Calais for over 150 years before it was lost during Elizabeth's reign, due in part to the French Huguenots who joined forces with the Catholics to reclaim the port, did that impact the opinion or potential danger of the Huguenots in England during Shakespeare's lifetime?
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, it's right at the end of Mary I's reign that Calais is finally lost to England, and there's the sort of there's this saying, perhaps apocryphal, that she sort of says that she'll have Calais and the words Calais and Philip written on her heart after if you look at it, after she dies.
Well, I know Shakespeare uses the phrase "onward to Calais" in several of his plays, and I wondered if there was a cultural recognition for a phrase like that, or an association in the 16th, 17th century for what Calais stood for in their minds.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there is. It's probably not straightforward. I mean, so after the outbreak of the French religious wars, English forces briefly occupy another French coastal town, the port of Le Havre. But they're soon kicked out of there. And in 1564, they sign a document known as the Treaty of Troyes, which officially recognises French ownership of Calais in return for a payment by France to England of 120,000 crowns or thereabouts, which is an enormous sum of money at the time. I mean, yes, as you sort of point out, there are some Huguenot troops who take part in the French recapture of Calais. It's fairly common at that time for Protestant troops to serve in Catholic armies or Catholic troops to serve in Protestant armies, because there are a lot of mercenaries, etc. at the time. So I don't think the Huguenots are singled out for specific blame. Indeed, after the 1572 St. Bartholomew's Day massacres in France, when the Huguenots in Paris and in the provinces are slaughtered in the thousands, there's an attitude of real sympathy by English Protestants towards, what they see as being their sort of persecuted religious brethren. I mean, specifically on how they sort of react to the loss of Calais, there's an article been written recently, or an essay that's been written recently on this by a historian called David Grummett, talking about sort of English reactions to the loss of Calais. And he sort of identifies a kind of a series of different reactions. So to begin with, in the immediate aftermath of the loss of Calais, people start talking about treason. There must have been some kind of fifth column inside the town. There must have been some kind of deceit. Someone must have opened the gate and let them in. And of course, by the time Elizabeth comes to the throne, it becomes very easy for Protestants to blame the failures of the Catholic government of Mary I in losing Calais. They weren't paying proper attention to it. They didn't support them enough. And they explain the defeat really in terms of God's providence. So, it's God's judgment against the sinfulness of a Catholic queen that she loses Calais for England as a punishment for abandoning the Protestant faith. Later in the reign, you start to get sort of chivalric narratives that emphasise the heroism of the English defenders. So, yes, they lost, but they did it in a sort of a noble way. They really tried hard. And by the end of the reign of Elizabeth, you start getting more objective discussions of military performance and tactics. So, for example, they start to recognise the brilliant leadership of the French forces by the Duke of Guise. The popular response, it was commented on at the time, and sort of Grummett suggests, was maybe closer to sort of apathy and resignation. I mean, I'm a historian rather than a literary scholar, but I've had a quick look, and Shakespeare only mentions Calais about a dozen times, I think, in the whole of the complete works, and they're all in the history plays. So, 5 times in Henry V, 3 times in Richard II, twice in Henry IV Part 1, and once each Henry IV Part 3 in King John. So by the time Shakespeare is writing, I think English ownership of Calais is something to look back on with pride. The loss of Calais is still a cause of regret, but I think it's very much something sort of consigned to the past rather than a source of continuing sort of present concern.
I think you've definitely helped us see what we mean when we say that Shakespeare was writing in a time of complicated politics and where the smallest of references could swing widely across the scope of acceptance in terms of how offended somebody got at what you put on stage. It makes sense when you look at it like this, how it was, as you've pointed out, complicated and involved in terms of what people thought about different things that they saw on stage. And I know we would love to learn more about this topic. What are some of your favorite books or resources you might recommend for us where we could go and learn more?
Well, there's a huge amount of stuff out there on the Reformation. I'll give you three things.
Okay.
Just to be try and be a bit concise, and things that are hopefully fairly accessible, available to people. I think one of the best general surveys is a book by Dermot McCulloch, the Oxford professor of the history of the Church, called Reformation: Europe's House Divided, and that covers the development of the Reformation in England. He's a specialist in England, but also in Eastern Europe, in Scandinavia, in France, in Spain, in Italy. And so if you want to think about the interconnections between the French Wars of Religion and the reign of Elizabeth, then that's a really good sort of general work. You get a more detailed picture of the English Reformation in a recent book, Peter Marshall's 2017 book, Heretics and Believers, A New History of the English Reformation. And that gives you a really sort of powerful narrative of the English Reformation over the course of the 16th century, and a lot of detail. And then finally, if you want to read up on the French Wars of Religion, I think the best sort of survey is a book by Mac P. Holt, just called French Wars of Religion. And that gives you a really sort of interesting overview of political developments in France at the time.
We ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me that I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so this choice would be in addition to those.
Okay, well, that's a great question. I'm not going to pick a history book. I don't know if I should do, but I'm not going to. I think I would have to take The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It's a book that I've read, one of the few books that I've read and reread regularly since I was a child, and it's one that I always sort of enjoy going back to. And it's long, so, it helps pass the time on the desert island.
And it is something you can return to. So yes, a very happy deserted island there for you. And we should mention that Dr. Willis has written several books on religion and the English Reformation as well. So be sure to check the show notes to find links to those. Well, Jonathan, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm quite excited. I've got a year of study leave opening up before me at the moment, so I've got some time to really get stuck into my new project, which is on a series of letters written by ordinary people during the reign of Elizabeth I, which survive in the English state papers. I say ordinary people because they're very strange letters. I mean, I'll give you one example just to save time. There's a letter by a guy called Miles Fry, who styles himself Emmanuel Plantagenet, and claims to be the illegitimate son of Elizabeth I and God, whisked away at childbirth by the angel Gabriel, brought up in the West Country, and now he's sort of come back to reclaim his birthright. That's an extreme example, but they're all letters by people who are described in the archives as distracted or mad or frantic or insane. And so I'm interested in thinking about what these letters tell us about ideas around mental health and mental illness in early modern England, around the psychological impact of the English Reformation, around cultures of complaint, and the sort of emotional and psychological dimension of sort of religious identity in the period.
That's fascinating. Please touch base with us again once you've wrapped up this project. I know we would love to see how it comes out because that sounds very exciting. Dr. Jonathan Willis, thank you so much for being here this week and sharing this information with us. This has been a fun conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very much enjoyed it.
There's even more history on the English Reformation and Shakespeare's Henry V packed into the show notes for today's episode. You'll find links to the books Jonathan Willis has written on the English Reformation, as well as his recommendations on where you can start if you want to explore this topic further. Find all that and more at cassidycash.com/episode 73. That's cassidycash.com/EP73. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at cassidycash.com/Shakespeare app. That's cassidycash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.